Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Linda, and I'm originally from Michigan, now living in the St. Louis metro area. I'm a college coach with School Match for You and have a daughter at University of Chicago.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I come to you this morning elated and exuberant from Southern Ontario. Yes, I know what some of you are saying. Why are you recording a podcast at your mom's 85th? Well, the festivities are over and they exceeded expectations. Thursday night, we all went out to this incredible Indian restaurant. We had the whole place to ourselves. It was magnificent. And Friday night, we billed it as a celebration of my brother Norm and his oldest daughter, Norm's younger than me, but his oldest daughter is older than any of my kids. She was 29 on the 29th, so we had a big celebration there. And last night was the big grand Kuba, or whatever you call it. It was awesome. Just made a word up there, by the way. We had this private room rented over Lake Erie. Everything was 5-star, 5-star, 5-star. And my mom only wanted family members there, so there were 18 of us, and we were literally there from 3:45 p.m. until almost 9. And I have a little bit of Dave in me. I never thought that I would ever spend so much money at one place. It was over $1,000 for my family, and it was worth every penny just to celebrate Mom. And she's really an extraordinary woman. I know we all feel that way about our moms. If Dave was on here, he could tell you story after story about my mom, and I can only imagine when she passes how many people are going to come to that funeral. But I'm going to record this, do one client meeting with, believe it or not, a client in Toronto. I only have one Canadian client, and I'll be meeting them today. And then I take Joy and I head to the airport and fly back. And Karis has basically adopted Canada as her new home. She's a Spanish tutor, so she can live anywhere. She's spent 4 months here, just feeling it's my last living grandparent. I'm going to spend as much time as I can with her before, she moves in with Joy at the end of the month in Durham and their lease starts. But I am a little, might sound over-caffeinated. I'm really, really high right now. This is a special trip, and I just feel so blessed to be able to be here. Today, though, it's time to talk about all things college admissions and shift gears and get out of family mode. So I've teased this out the last couple of weeks and, ended up doing it now just because we were in the middle of a part 1, part 2, but I'm going to be talking about the changes in U.S. News and World Report's rankings, which are the most significant changes they've had in 40 years, causing quite a kerfuffle in the world of college admissions. And then we'll have Eric Kneubuehl, the Associate Vice Chancellor at East Carolina University, and we're talking about all things related to student engagement. The importance of student engagement and the correlation with success. That's Lisa's interview. That'll be part 2 of 4. We said part 3 last week, but we decided to go with slightly shorter segments there. So that'll be a 4-parter, and we're at the halfway point after today. But let's dive in and talk college rankings. If you're a longtime listener, you know the antipathy I have for these rankings. They're like nails on a chalkboard to me, and I'm sure you will sense that as you hear what I have to say today. If you're somebody who doesn't like a lot of reading, I'm not sure how much you're going to like this. I'm going to read a fair amount today from 4 different articles, 2 of them in the New York Times, 1 CNN, and 1 in Inside Higher Ed. And if you're a fan, then you're going to like it. I have a family in Hawaii, 2 families in Hawaii I'm actually working with, but I talked to one of them. who's a podcast listener, and I said, I read a lot last time. Was that okay? She's like, I like it when you do that. So based on my sample of one, I'm taking a green light to go ahead and read a lot. I just want you guys to understand a lot of the content directly from the source. And then at the end, I'm going to share 10 or 11 points about these rankings. So first of all, I'm going to start out sharing quite a few things from New York Times article that says, with the new formula, U.S. News ranking boosts some state universities. And I'll do a little bit of running commentary along the way to break it up, but I'll save most of my commentary for toward the end. So, it's about 2 weeks ago now on a Monday, U.S. News released its most substantial overhaul of its rankings, which came out in literally 1983. So it really is 40 years of what's been dubbed a ranking empire. And more than a dozen public universities, many of them with low profiles, had massive climbs in these new rankings, like 50-spot climbs. For example, Fresno State moved up 64 places to 185. Florida Atlantic, 53 places to 209. And then some other public universities, who are already fairly high, had smaller gains, but still very noticeable. For example, Rutgers has the 3 campuses, right? New Brunswick, Newark, and Camden. All of the campuses rose at least 15 places in the rankings. And why did this happen? Well, they benefited from an algorithm that helped certain public schools and sent certain private schools plummeting. And it represents an effort to account for more of the ideals in higher education. Namely, are they transforming lives of economically disadvantaged students? And, I'm going to save my fire for the end, but I'll just say this. One of the many, many, many reasons I've had so much antipathy for U.S. News rankings is I thought it was absolutely preposterous that they never really factored diversity into education, socioeconomic, racial, and all other aspects of diversity. I thought that's ridiculous. Anyone in education knows that you improve the quality of the learning environment when you're exposed to a lot of different people. And so, this new version attempts to do that more so than they have in the past. It doesn't mean that I like them, because I don't, but it is something that they attempted to do. Now, we've talked about this before. There was massive walkout, and especially in the law school and the medical school, over this issue. And so I think they've been afraid that, in some ways it's trying to stop the hemorrhaging from more people leaving, but because you can't rank a school, there's no one size fits everybody. You're going to, make some people happy, and other people, you're going to tick them off. Anyway, the reworked formula assigns greater emphasis to several things. Graduation rates for students who received need-based Pell grants. So they're putting more emphasis on, Pell Grant recipient, what's your graduation rate? Also retention for Pell Grant recipients. And the easiest way to think of Pell Grant recipients, especially with the new formula, because it's easier to qualify for Pell, just think of it as the bottom half of the population when it comes to income and assets. Okay, it's more complicated than that, because they do look at things like number of kids in college, age of the oldest parent, assets, because you can't compare a family with 7 kids to a family with 1 and just go with like a pure income number. But basically think about it as the bottom half. I used to say the bottom 40%, but the new formula makes it easier to qualify for Pell. So that's just the easiest way to think of it. It also includes metrics that are tied to first-generation students and to whether recent grads were earning more than people who only went to high school. So, however, this does not minimize the criticism at all. In the past, U.S. News rankings have basically been a proxy for prestige. And that's really what they've been. And that, continues to be the case today. And I don't see anything changing there. Critics say they skew the priorities of colleges in how they admit students. And, I don't even think that's debatable. I mean, I've had presidents on the podcast that I've interviewed, more than one, that have talked about the pressure they as presidents feel to move their school up the rankings. And I remember a family I worked with some years ago who was a board of trustee member, and she talked about how that would be a regular conversation that they would have, is moving the rankings for the school. So there's plenty of evidence. Now, this and several of the articles do quote L. Son Richardson, president of Colorado College, who says, and I agree with this, the methodology is slightly better, but it still does not ease my concerns. And as you know, Colorado College was one of 4 schools to drop out of the undergraduate rankings, in 2023. And one thing she says is, I certainly am thrilled that they're starting to listen to what higher ed leaders have been saying to them, meaning they've been ignoring these other factors which are so important in higher education. However, it still does not, still can't peg a school and say you're number 29 or you're number 69 or you're number 129. For who? All right. And the article goes on to say that however philosophical hostile the rankings might be, they often are embraced as marketing tools. Now, the company discarded 5 factors that often favor wealthy colleges, and literally those factors made up 18% of a school's score. So think about that. You've got this 40-year-old rankings in place, and you got rid of what was 18% of a school's score. Just like that in a change. Once again, showing how completely subjective and arbitrary these are. This new formula, which is relied more on data sources beyond just submissions from schools, gave less weight to overall grad rates, less weight to the financial resources per student. They got rid of looking at how much a university spends per student on things like instruction and research. And the new formula does not count small class size at all. That used to be 8% of the score. They got rid of it. And that had been a matter of pride for a lot of elite private schools. And so getting rid of that completely changed the algorithm. And it caused many of your wealthier private schools that were scoring a lot of points caused many of your wealthy schools that were scoring a lot of points in these metrics to drop. You get rid of resources per student, you get rid of small class size. So here's a couple examples. University of Chicago, number 6 last year, moved to 12. Dartmouth dropped 6 places from 12 to 18. Wash U in St. Louis was number 15 last year, dropped to 24th. Brandeis fell 16 spots from 44th to 60th. And even more than that, Wake Forest dropped 18 spots from 29 to 47. And one of the biggest drops amongst these private schools was Tulane. It had been 44. It dropped to 73. Michael Fitz, Tulane's president, said he was shocked by his university's drop. And he attributed to a radical different methodology which undercut schools like mine. He says large public universities, he argues, are better suited to meet the abruptly introduced ambitions of the U.S. News rankings. But that the caliber of a place like Tulane had not ebbed overnight. Yeah, the school didn't change overnight. The ranking formula just changed. And that's why one reason I want to talk about this is I'm hoping you guys who put credibility in these rankings will say, snap, should I really be putting stock in rankings that just cause these shifts by one tweak of the pen and one change in formula like this? Goes on to say, do they have the best of both worlds now or the worst of both worlds? He asked, referring to U.S. News. Are they conflating different criteria by looking at your ability to enroll a broad, large class of students? Or are you looking at the sort of academic quality of the students while they're there? To the irritation of many administrators, U.S. News retained its equal weight on its survey of presidents, provosts, and deans. Okay, now this is something that is unique to U.S. News and has probably been its most controversial part of how it ranks. They send out a survey to presidents, provosts, and deans of admission, and they ask them to rank the academic caliber of other schools. They call it a reputational score. But many people have said, I don't know anything about these schools they're sending me. I only know my own school. So how in the world can you base a ranking on my opinion of hundreds of other schools I know nothing about. So critics have long asserted the survey, which counts for 20% of a school score, introduces a completely subjective element into the criteria. And U.S. News has pushed back and said, well, we've declined that number over the years, but we do believe that reputation matters in society. And so we're asking for the reputation of various schools by asking these people who we feel are knowledgeable, president, provost, and deans. Now, some of the country's best-known universities did also improve. Columbia, which had been as high as 2, and you remember the controversy they had, caught fabricating their rankings, so they pulled out. They dropped to 18 for inaccurate data, and now they're back up to 12. Cal Berkeley and UCLA came in as the top 2 public schools in the country, tying at 15th, moving from 20th. And if you know anything about the UC system, you know that they have tremendous diversity, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic, large numbers of Pell students compared to some of the other public schools that they're often compared to that don't have as much. Other institutions blamed their declines on the methodology itself. Chicago, the only university to fall out of the top 10 recently, said this: we believe in and remain committed to academics and the fundamentals that have long defined the University of Chicago experience, such as our smaller class size, the educational level of our instructors, considerations that got eliminated from the U.S. News metrics, said in a statement. Wake Forest voiced similar concerns. Quote, Wake has never made decisions or determined strategy based on chasing rankings, such as those from U.S. News. That's Susan Wente, the president, and she said, and we do not intend to start now. U.S. News is accustomed to these complaints. The publisher has given no signal, though, it is interested in abandoning the system that brings in millions of eyeballs and millions and multi-millions of dollars. So that was an article that ran in the Times. Another article that ran in Inside Higher Ed has some more points to make. Higher selective institutions like Princeton and Stanford still occupy the top spots thanks to a beefed up social mobility metric. A number of public institutions have climbed significantly. So this Inside Higher Ed article, here's a quote: the social mobility metric isn't brand new to the list. The rankings powerhouse began considering how institutions improved their graduates' economic standing back in 2018. But this year it's placed a greater emphasis on outcomes and mobility, according to a press release, calling the most significant methodological change in rankings history. Why would they put that in a press release? Because it's controversial. What does controversy do? It gets clicks. What does that do? It sells magazines. What does that do? It makes money. Okay, this is one of the reasons why Trump has been so successful. He knows I can stir up controversy. I can literally counter-program a debate I don't go to and do something controversial. And the media is like lemmings. They need ratings. They have to cover me. And, you know, his sort of reptilian brilliance in that way, I hate to use that word with that guy, the former guy, but it's true, generates business, generates clicks. And that's the same thing that U.S. News is doing, right? Generating controversy, calling it the biggest overhaul in 40 years, knowing it's going to stir up controversy. One might argue I'm contributing to that by having this conversation, but I also believe it's important to be educated and to be knowledgeable about what's going on here. So to me, that positive outweighs, giving it a little bit more publicity. U.S. News made the shift partly in response to the criticism that it puts a premium on prestige. So this has long been a criticism of U.S. News compared to, say, Washington Monthly's formula, which has been focused on social mobility. Forbes' formula, Wall Street Journal formula, focused a lot more on the economic income type data that graduates have. So these formulas, these rankings all have different formulas based on their own biases. And that's extremely important that people understand this. In the last month, I've had 4 people reach out to me about rankings. 3 of them I worked with, and another was just a podcast listener who reached out. And in each time, it was somewhat seen as credible. Like, tell me about the latest rankings. Tell me where the students on my school's list are ranked, one person said. Another one sent me an article sort of like, look at this. The implication was, isn't this good? Look at this ranking. And so I know that people look at this. I see it all the time. There's power out there in these things. The article goes on to say that after it says U.S. News made the shift because of the premium on prestige, it said this year open access institutions with more low income and more minority students saw the benefits of the new metrics. So it points out a different group of schools that benefited. It points to the City University of New York, CUNY, and to San Diego State. They both jumped 46 places. It mentions Rutgers like the other article does, but it also mentions Texas A&M. Never cracked the top 50 before, and this time it did. And then it mentions a different group of private schools that don't have a lot of socioeconomic diversity. They fell. American University dropped 33 places from 72 to 105. Now tied with City College and San Diego State. Pepperdine, another school with a lot of wealth, not a lot of socioeconomic diversity. It fell by 21 places. And it does mention Wake, like the other one did, fell out of the top 30 and fell by 18 places. And then it goes on to say, a few of this year's losers have publicly denounced the results as muddled and misleading. Some even implying this may be the final straw for their participation in the rankings. Vanderbilt, which fell from 13th to 18th, responded by posting a message from Chancellor Daniel Diermeier excoriating the lack of rigor and competence that is increasingly characterizing U.S. News annual lists, and referred to the many glaring flaws in the rankings' new methodology, which he said are entirely responsible for their fall. Diermeier told Inside Higher Ed that he considered it important to speak out and correct what he saw as a deeply flawed list. Here's a quote. U.S. News has set aside well-established and standard measures of educational quality, such as class size, faculty qualifications in terms of the highest degrees, and also test scores and grades of the student body. That is highly worrisome. And then the question of quality gets mashed into that of outcomes and affordability, and those metrics are deeply flawed, noting that U.S. News did not take Vanderbilt's income-driven debt-free program into account when they looked at affordability. Choosing a college is already so complicated, so having clear information is critical for students and families. The information in U.S. News is misleading. Another outspoken critic is Oberlin College. They fell more than 10 spots to land outside of the top 50 in the liberal arts and science rankings. Their president, Carmen Twillie Amber, said the rankings fail to recognize excellence and do a disservice to institutions' distinct character. I agree with everything she said there, by the way. Such reactions show that despite a series of high-profile defections and evidence that prospective applicants are increasingly becoming apathetic toward numerical rankings, but U.S. News marquee product still occupies a prominent place in the marketing and self-image of many institutions. The blowback reveals deepening ambivalence about their influences, as colleges' long simmering frustrations with the rankings threatens to boil over. And a spokesperson for U.S. News defended the new methodology, saying this: "We made changes to our rankings as appropriate and to reflect the changing landscape of higher education. We know that comparing diverse academic institutions across a common data set is challenging." Yeah, but they still continue to do it and think it's valid because it makes the money. Christopher Newfield, a higher education scholar and research director of the Independent Social Research Foundation in London, said U.S. News methodology changes don't actually address the main criticism leveled at the rankings. If anything, he said, they confuse consumers by melding metrics of social mobility with entirely unrelated factors like selectivity and graduation rate. The list presents challenges in rank as signs of improvement or backsliding, when, as Vanderbilt noted, the methodologies change so frequently enough to render year-by-year comparisons meaningless. The persistent problem with the U.S. News rankings, Newfield continued, is that this is important, don't miss this, they sell colleges as products, defined either by their prestige or their employment returns, rather than as intellectually fortifying experiences. I got to repeat that. The persistent problem with U.S. News rankings, Newfield continues, is they sell colleges as products, defined either by their prestige or their employment returns, rather than intellectually fortifying experiences. Now, the product that's being sold is social mobility, he said. That's an improvement over status and prestige, but neither one of those are about the intellectual, non-pecuniary benefits of a college education. Now, they have some defenders. Javidin Rodriguez, the president of University of Albany, part of the SUNY system, they rose 48 spots from 118 to 70 this year. Said the change represents an important acknowledgement of the work institutions like his are doing to serve underprivileged students and to connect them to the workforce. And then Rodriguez says this, I'm not one to focus on rankings, but the changes this year tell a pretty compelling story about the mission of higher ed. U.S. News is finally catching up. Now, I thought there were some great quotes from the principal of a higher ed consulting company firm, TVP Communications, Teresa Valerio Parrott. She said the backlash to this year's rankings connotes a kind of hypocrisy in college's complicated relationship with a longtime sector giant U.S. News. So here's what she says. With rankings, I love this quote, sometimes you're the windshield and sometimes you're the bug. And then she says this, it's never good to try to force a teachable moment when you're only interested in the actual outcome. In other words, you're trying to make a point, Vanderbilt, when you drop, but you didn't make the point when you rose other than to tout your rankings to all your constituencies. So here's the quote. I feel like we've got to see a number of institutions who in the past have either been silent or have praised where they were in the rankings. And with this year's methodological change, suddenly they have objections and grievances. And then she says, that's not really a great look. Diermeyer said he understands why, by the way, she's talking to you, Vanderbilt. Diermeyer said he understands why some saw his statement as petulant. Remember, Diermeyer's the Vanderbilt leader. Considering that the relative small dip in the institution, Vanderbilt still remains in the top 20. But he insisted that the substance of his critique is worth discussion. Here's a quote. We did get the predictable reaction. That's sour grapes. You're a privileged institution. Sure. The most important thing to me is that we have a serious debate about this, he said. Will we have information that allows our parents and students to make informed decisions about college choice? Or is it just an annual circus that's a distraction? So, he's right. We should have a debate. The debate should be that comprehensive rankings, and it's not just U.S. News, that put schools in an ordinal rank are bogus because it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all approach. It is, and that should be the debate. But you lose credibility when you only speak up when you drop, and you celebrate the rankings when you like them. One middle ground solution, and I love this, by the way, is to pay the rankings no mind whatsoever. That's what 19 liberal arts colleges presidents swore to do in 2007 letter. Now, I remember this when this happened, when this broke out, and I celebrated then. I cannot believe it was 16 years ago. I remember having a conversation with Haverford College because they were one of the 19 to join, along with Williams, Amherst, Bowdoin, and many others. And basically what they said was this. It's hypocritical for us to decry the rankings and then to turn around and have in our literature and our information sessions, we're ranked 8th, we're ranked 10th, we're ranked 16th. And so we're just going to ignore you completely. We're not going to celebrate you when we get a good ranking and then criticize you when we get a bad ranking. Here's the quote. We commit not to mention U.S. News or similar rankings in any of our publications. I remember Susan and I, we were really happy when these 19 schools made this decision. I was working with Susan back. This is 2007. I was at the Westtown School. We are concerned about the inevitable biases in any single ranking formula, about the admissions frenzy and the way in which rankings contribute to that frenzy. That to me is a higher ground position. And by the way, Williams and Amherst are still coming out at the top of these rankings, and they refuse to mention them because they know you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. I was talking to somebody the other day I'm working with, and they said, I really like this school. I visited, but why isn't it ranked higher? And I started talking to them about how bogus these rankings are. And, this particular parent likes smaller schools over really large schools. And I said, that's not factored in at all, right? And then I started talking about test scores. And then she said, that's really, really important. I said, well, then everybody should go to MIT, I guess. Guess what? Most people would not do well at MIT. Okay, they wouldn't. So is MIT really the number one school for you if it's not a place where your child would do well? Anyway, let me get off my hobby horse. Here's a quote from Williams' chief communication officer, and I respect them. They're at the top. They could go around and tout they're number one all the time. But here's what he said. U.S. News' recent methodological changes have not swayed our college to revisit the pact we made in 2007. Scott Hood, the longtime senior vice president of communication at Bowdoin's College, another one of the 19 colleges that signed on, he said most of the undersigned colleges still refrain from mentioning their rankings in any public statements. That is the integrity view. We're not going to tout you when we like them and decry you when we don't. We're not going to mention you at all because we think it's a completely invalid way for a person to pick a school. SUNY Albany's Rodriguez noted it can be difficult to avoid addressing rankings, whether the news around you is positive or negative. Now, this is true, and I feel for schools. So this is what SUNY's president says. Every year when they come out, I get many emails from alumni about it. It's really hard for leaders to ignore them. I am not naive about that. We live in a world where people think that they're credible. I'm trying my best to convince people that ranking colleges is like ranking churches. When I say, how would you feel about a ranking of churches? People would laugh at it. I was talking to somebody earlier this week who wanted a list of rankings I'm working with. And I said, right now, U.S. News Award Report. This is true, you guys. You can look it up. They said the number one place to live in the country is Green Bay, Wisconsin. Well, it's not for me. I don't like cold weather. First of all, it's not diverse enough for me. And I could give you many other reasons I don't want to live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I'm sure it's a lovely place. I'm not putting down anybody that lives there. I'm certainly not putting down anybody who thinks it's the best place to live. That's your decision based on your eye of what beauty is to you and what factors you care about. But you can't tell me Green Bay, Wisconsin is the best place for me to live because I make that decision. You don't get to control for me what factors I value. But for some reason, the public has bought into the idea that there's credibility in these things. And I'm talking mostly about the cumulative rankings here. I'll have more to say about other rankings in a second. Valerie Perot said she understands why many institutions, especially those struggling to attract applicants, would amplify positive ranking results. But when it comes to responding to a disappointing result, she believes shrugging it off is the best strategy. So often we in higher ed think this list is about us, and it's a review of us. But this is really about a for-profit news outlet trying to make money. We need to remember that the emotion we tie to this isn't reciprocal. They're just trying to make money and sell magazines. She's got some good things to say. Vanderbilt and Oberlin are both threatening to join the four schools last year, Colorado College, Stillman College, Rhode Island School of Design, and Columbia, that dropped out of the undergraduate rankings. Both Vanderbilt and Oberlin threatened as conscientious objectors, citing years of frustration and exacerbated by shifting metrics every year. Yeah, I'd be frustrated too. Every year, they change their formula and people put all this weight and stock in it, including a lot of members in your own constituency, like parents and alumni and board of trustees. So it's very frustrating. And that's why I don't want to be self-righteous here. I saw when rankings really started creeping into the boarding school world, and it's just people just thought they were fact. You're 7 and you're 17. 7's better than 17. You're the better school. That's how people thought. Quote, these radical movements in ranking positions are more indicative of how arbitrary U.S. News rankings are rather than an indicator of the change in quality, wrote the president at Oberlin. higher education should no longer allow U.S. News rankings to influence the narrative about college quality and excellence. We will continue to evaluate what this means for Oberlin's future participation in these rankings. So that's their threat to walk. Vanderbilt's leaders made a similar veiled threat, referencing Columbia's decision to withdraw, saying they are considering our next steps. The university's law school and medical school is already withdrawn, part of a much more robust protest amongst law schools and professional graduate programs. And by the way, Yale led that, and they were number one at the time, and they broke away and said, this is ridiculous. You're using flawed metrics. And in the case of law schools, also in the case of undergraduate, if you're going to put a big emphasis on high caliber of students, then what you're doing is you're leading schools to shift all their need-based money to merit-based money to try to buy students to climb up in the rankings. And then you turn around and have a school that's all wealthy because you shifted your money toward merit-based, not need-based, in an attempt to move up the ranking. That's the kind of thing that's been happening. The prospect of breaking from the rankings machine is still a hard sell, as the 2007 letter from the 19 small colleges acknowledged. And this is a quote, and this is from them. And remember, these are the ones that broke away and said, we're not going to use it in any of our publications. We're not going to talk about it in information sessions because we don't believe in it, and we're not giving it any more oxygen. Here's a quote. No degree of protest may make these rankings disappear. Now, Diermeyer was non-committal when asked about the possibility of withdrawing Vanderbilt's undergraduate program, but he said he hoped U.S. News took his round of complaints more seriously than they did in the past. And he recognized a similar erosion of patience amongst his peers at other schools. Quote, we have expressed our concern forcefully and repeatedly. We're just being ignored. We're not quite sure what's our next step, but we're definitely going to reevaluate. There's growing pressure out there. And I'm going to quote a few things recently from an article that talked about why schools don't drop out if they're so terrible. Newfield said that until the criticisms morph into action, they just provide more visibility to the rankings. In other words, all you're doing is amplifying them. Some might argue that's what I'm doing here. It's a tough line. You could argue all publicity is good publicity. You're giving them more publicity, or you could argue you're exposing the fallacies of them and helping educate the population. What I choose to do is do it every so often, but not harp on it. I think if I harped on it, it would be true. Hopefully, I'm not doing that. We have to move away from this commercial product, he said. It's an uphill battle, but it would really work a lot better if people like the president of Vanderbilt and the presidents in general would just commit to that, to just ignoring them like the 19 schools that signed that 2007 letter did, instead of hand-wringing about the specifics. Okay, so here's an article I said I'd referenced that came out in New York Times called Why Colleges Can't Quit U.S. News Rankings. And it also quotes Song Richardson, the president of Colorado College. And she says, I'm just going to read a small part here. For schools that lack the cachet of a Princeton or University of California, Berkeley, a ranking can be among a school's most powerful marketing tools. Now, once again, she wasn't advocating for them. She supports the decision to pull out, but she's sympathetic to the fact that she knows the pressures. Because she also goes on to say, the rankings are so entrenched in higher education that many administrators can scarcely fathom not participating, especially as they confront the pressures of changing demographics and falling enrollments. And then in a CNN article called U.S. News Changes Its College Rankings to Emphasize Diversity and Remove Alumni Giving, there's a great quote from Miguel Cardona, the U.S. Department of Education Secretary. And he's been very, very vociferous in his criticism of the rankings and how they're creating warped incentives for schools. So here's what he says. Too often, our best resource students are chasing rankings that mean very little on measures that truly count. That system of ranking is a joke. He criticized the whole science behind climbing up the rankings, which he said emphasizes wealth and affluence instead of broad opportunity. All right, few final thoughts. I'm hoping that when you see an organization that's been around for 40 years, that changes its formula every year and can have schools drop 50 points in 1 year, I'm hoping you're seeing how highly subjective that is and how it's not something that you can trust. I'm hoping you see that it's a commercial enterprise designed to sell magazines and make money, and that they love the controversy. There's a saying, when you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that yelps the loudest is usually the one that got hit. Vanderbilt yelled really loud, And on one hand, I totally understand it. The public's using these things to define you. You want to sit here like a punching bag, or do you want to defend yourself? I understand that. I understand exposing the fallacious nature of the rankings. However, when you put your hand on the stove, don't be surprised if you get burned. Many of them carping the loudest are the first ones to tout U.S. News and World Report in their marketing. And so now they're stuck because they've given them credibility. You've given them credibility. Now they come out with something, it doesn't give you a real leg to stand on. I really support what those 19 small colleges did 16 years ago. We won't mention them at all, whether they're good or bad. But I'm sympathetic to struggling colleges who are not at the top of the pecking order, and it's super, super competitive out there. And the mindset that the public has is, of course, you're going to tell me that you're good. You're a salesperson, but I want outside substantiation. I remember a family I worked with 5 years ago from New York City, and they went to 2 selective Boston schools that they were admitted at for admitted student visit programs. And I followed up with them after the visit. And they told me, one school kept telling me, we're ranked this, we're ranked that, we're ranked this, we're ranked that. And the other school didn't say anything. And the way they interpreted it was that they didn't have anything to say. And the other school was proud of themselves. And so I understand why a school feels pressure to constantly say, we're ranked this, we're ranked that, we're ranked this, we're ranked that. If a family's going to interpret that as that convinces me that you're good. So I'm sympathetic to that pressure. Another important point. This is really important, and I'm going to editorialize a little bit here, but I feel really strongly about this. Someone taught me a long time ago, it was the most profound things I ever learned. Those in power write the rules in such a way to declare themselves the winners. There's no doubt in my mind, if U.S. News and World Report ran its formula and it turned out that Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford were not at the top, or Williams and Amherst were not at the top, that they would change it. They wouldn't run with that. They would change it. They literally would change the formula. And maybe they would do it because maybe they would think, well, I don't think the public's going to believe these. Or maybe it's something even more sinister. I don't know this for sure, but I suspect, and there's been some investigative reporting on this, that those with a lot of power have vested interest in certain schools being at the top for their own personal reasons. I don't have evidence of that, but I'm very, very suspicious of that. Very suspicious that certain schools have protective status. No matter how many times the formula changed, they'll make the formula change to protect, like I said, those in power write the rules to declare themselves the winners. Think about that. Okay, something that's important. I think it's important to differentiate between cumulative ratings, data rankings, and individual major rankings. As you can tell, I bristle, I recoil, I'm nails on a chalkboard anytime anybody, and this happens on our podcast sometimes, somebody mentions a school's ranking as if it's fact, as if it's objective. Cumulative rankings aren't worth the ink that's spent to write them. That's what I really believe. But I do believe you can have data rankings, and some of those I think are very credible. Give me an example. What are you talking about? I look at the endowment per student for private schools. That's an important metric. It tells me a lot about a school. I look at the Pell Grant percentage. That tells me a lot about the compositional diversity of a school. And I think you can look at other metrics like, income metrics for graduates and things like that. I don't see those things as invalid. So individual data categories to me are valid. Now you have to be careful you don't misinterpret them. For example, graduation rate, it tells me a lot about a school if it's high, but it also tells me a lot about the wealth of the parent body and that the school has more full-time than part-time students. So that's also important to get factored in. So it's a lot more nuanced. Now, what about individual major rankings? Individual major rankings, they're way better than cumulative rankings, but you still need to be aware of the subjectivity involved in them. Normally, when an individual school is ranked very high, it's a very good school. It doesn't mean that it's very good for you. Example, let's say a school's ranked 7th in business, 7th in nursing, okay? That's going to usually, not always, but usually tell me they have a very good business or a very good nursing program. First thing I'm going to do is look at the formula, but then the next thing I'm going to say is, okay, what if a school's ranked really high, but you don't like the location or you don't like the campus setting? You're a city person and it's in the middle of nowhere. You're in the middle, you you like more remote locations and it's in a city? What if you don't like the size of the school? What if you don't like the distance from home? What if you don't like the cost of the school? What if you don't like the composition of the student body or the teaching style? So you still, even with these individual, rankings by subject, you can't say this is 7th and this is 3rd. Now, you can say it's the 3rd hardest to get into. Okay. You can say it has the 3rd highest test score. You can do individual metric rankings, but it's still subjective, but it's not nowhere near as subjective as saying overall it's the 7th best school. So I do differentiate. There's like degrees, right? Individual data rankings, no problem, because you're making a decision how you use that data. Individual major rankings, way better than cumulative rankings, but just because the school's ranked high, it still doesn't mean it's a good match. So I hope that differentiation helps. All right, friends, I know I went on for a really, really, really long time. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you now enjoy Lisa's interview with Eric Kneubuehl.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, it's time for part 2 of Lisa's interview with Dr. Kneubuehl, and he's teaching us everything about student success and student engagement. And in this part, Dr. Kneubuehl answers the question, what do you do with students who are not engaged, with students who are not involved? Eric talks about the difference between in-person versus virtual student engagement. Eric talks about the importance of student orientation, and he talks about a surprising but impressive decision that the football coach made at ECU. And then Eric gives advice for transfer students. Listen and enjoy.
Yeah, it's really impressive, both from the predictive analytics that you're using to try to, invite students to different things. And then also just the way you're so consciously trying to bring them the opportunities and make it so easy for them to participate. Because I think, a lot of times it's like the barrier is emailing someone, right? Or the barrier is going to that office. And if you remove that, then you probably are going to get a lot more participation and success with that, which is great.
Absolutely.
So, I imagine though, despite your best efforts, let's say you've got like a student and somehow they're in a single room, they finagled that somehow and they get good grades, but they're not really having a friend group. They're not a trouble, but maybe, they're not engaged, and we might surmise there might be some depression or other issues happening. How do you get that student involved?
So, I will never tell you that we get 100% of them, right? But that is, the great conversation that you hear going around education now, this concept of student success, right? That's really what we're talking about, is trying to be the net that catches the people that are falling through the cracks, like that person who sequesters themselves in their residence hall room, right? The first thing that happens is every residence hall floor has an RA, a student RA. They start training August 1st. So they go through 3 weeks of training before school ever starts, right? And some of them are retraining because you have a lot of returning RAs. And they're on every floor. They have floor meetings. Their job to the about 20 or 30 students that they have is to get to know those students really well and to start, once again, to identify signs, right? They can do some quick conversations, some knocks on doors. Hey, what's going on? They have events in their building. So that, again, the events come to you. You don't have to come to the event, right? And all you have to do is step out your door and go 1 floor down or 10 feet to the right, and you're in a lounge, right? Almost every residence hall in the country is built now with lounges on every floor. So you want public meeting space on every floor. So there are opportunities to have those events so people don't have to change floors. So I think the industry is really focused heavily on getting the public space and the meeting space to students, particularly in these new generations where you can get online, you can get a video game, right? And you can lose yourself. You can still be talking to people, but never leave your space. And those RAs will check. When there is something that they find that's off, they've tried to talk to that student, maybe that student just seems sad or depressed or scared to come out, right? And the tips that they've learned to do aren't working. Every building then has a full-time staff member, right? So a full-time master's level staff person, they're called different things, but usually they're coordinators, in hall coordinators. They will then the RA will go to that person, and that person will have an opportunity to reach out to that student and have a more professional conversation, one that has one a little bit more gravitas because that's a staff member talking to you, right? But also somebody with a lot more experience. They've gone through a lot more training, educational training. They probably worked at our school or different schools, and they're really trying to engage with you to get you out of your comfort zone. And I think that's where we see a lot of referrals. We see a lot of emails through our network. Like we have about 350 staff in student affairs. And so we'll see people that will refer not just for mental health issues, but just loneliness or I just want to get out, right? Or they're just not, they feel like there's no club for them, there's no event for them, or they haven't met anybody, right? We get them out and then we start to engage them. And I will get emails all the time from staff that know me well or RAs and say, I'm having this problem with a student. They really want to get engaged in student government. And I was like, great, that's one of the areas that reports to me. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to invite that student to lunch. My rule is if I invite you to lunch, so if you're ever in the neighborhood, again, come let me invite you to lunch because then I pay, right? So I always pay when I invite.
Good to know.
So I invite them to lunch, right? And we do it strategically in the student center. And, it's not my first rodeo. We do strategic things like I invite them to lunch and then I have the vice president of student government happen to walk by mysteriously and say, hey, Matt, how are you doing? Here, meet Amy. Amy, Matt. Hey, Matt, sit down. And Matt's like, hey, where are you from? And Amy's like, well, I'm from Raleigh. Oh, I'm from Raleigh. Oh, my God, where? Oh my God, you got to get involved. Come on upstairs. Meet some of the people. Like, it's really that easy. That is recruitment 101, whether you go into a club, fraternity, sorority, a university, athletics, right? That is recruitment 101, is to have a personal touch. And I think people are surprised to hear that when you're talking about a university of 30,000 students. But the university, like a big city, is broken down into neighborhoods. In fact, literally, our Resenthal communities are called neighborhoods, ironically. Sure. But they're broken down to neighborhoods, and every neighborhood has a block, and every block has people who know each other and look out for each other, and has the older people who live on the block, the seasoned professionals, right, who look out even stronger for the younger folks to make sure they're going well. And so I think we do an excellent job of that. One of the ways you can tell when you're looking at institutions is look at their first-year retention rate. There is a retention rate that's a 5- and 6-year retention rate and a graduation rate they'll talk, but that first-year retention rate is so important because that first year is where you connect or you don't connect. Right, and ECU's retention rate hovers well into the high 70s, if not into the mid 80s, depending on the year. Coming out of COVID, it was a little bit harder, but going into COVID, we were hovering in the low 80s. So that retention rate is significant when you think about 4,000 freshmen, right, where we might lose 50 students, 100 students out of 4,000. And you never know why you lose them, right? Sometimes it's they didn't connect. Sometimes it's because something happened in their personal life at home that they want to be back at home. But I think we do an exceptional job, and the industry does an exceptional job of breaking down large communities into very small communities and to have personal touch so that people are talking to people one-on-one to understand truly what's going on and to engage with them, particularly those people that might be introverts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you find like any difference since COVID and like students' ability to consider engaging like in an interpersonal thing? Like maybe they're more used to this online engagement and it's a little bit of a shift?
So it's so funny. When we were in COVID, we had a lot of free time, right? And when you know what happens when you have free time, right? Your mind goes racing. You think of every worst possible scenario, right? And I had high-level administrators coming to me, much higher than me, saying, I don't think they're going to come back. I think parents have found this is easier to do it at home. Students are I just want to get on home. And I'm like, I don't think that's happening because my house was my 10-year-old. My wife's like, please, dear God, get him back to school because I don't have the patience to do this. And when you lose the patience, right, you get on each other's nerves because you can't escape. You're not like you're at school and go home. You're there all the time. And what ends up happening is a student becomes like, I really want to get out. I want to do other things. So actually coming out of the pandemic, we found students wanted to engage more in groups. Like even if we didn't have things going on that first year out, they would just gather in groups. And we're like, why are there? We planned for 100 students. Why are there 500 students at this event? Like, what's going on outside? Nothing. They're all just standing out there, and they all just started to do an impromptu singing thing, right? And started singing outside. And it's like, really? Like, this doesn't happen often, right? They wanted to engage. I think the struggle that we had post-pandemic was because we had virtual orientations still, And we got so accustomed to delivering things virtually, the virtual delivery is not the same as in person. It works in some ways, and it's fantastic in some ways, but it doesn't fully replace. You have to use it and blend them together. And at times across our industry, we tried to replace. Sometimes it was cost saving. Sometimes we didn't have enough staffing coming out of the pandemic, right? But we tried to replace it, and what we found is it doesn't do a very good job replacing it because students didn't. I had students that walked by our multicultural center every day. We have 7,000 people a day that comes through our student center. It's by one of the main doors that goes to the library. Every day I had literally 3,000 or 4,000 students walk by there. And I had students every day tell me they don't know where the multicultural center was. And I was like, they were so adamant that we didn't have one. And I was like, how do we, what? And then what I found is when you have the in-person orientation, we walked you by. We showed you, we walked you in spaces. Virtual, we told you about it. And we trusted that you were really paying attention. And so they didn't realize that. So we found that as they started to have those issues and were trying to create those bonds and those support networks, they were struggling in doing that because they didn't know what was available on the campus. And we assumed, of course they know, because all the other years they knew because we did a great job in the summer. And now it's like, oh, well, we didn't have. So the last 2 years we've finally been in person for orientations, and we've noticed again, what's great about college, working in a college environment, what's bad about working in a college environment is that students change so quickly. So when you love them and they're awesome and they're great student leaders, they leave, right? And when they're not learning and they're frustrating the heck out of you, they leave, right? So there's a positive and negative. And what we found is as that first 2 years of COVID students kind of blended out and moved out and blended into the new students that had in-person orientations, everybody started to know where everything was again. And so we are starting to see, we still see higher than normal attendance at programs and events. So we're still seeing that tick, which I hope continues. In fact, we've had the plan for, we call it the pizza quotient, where we're planning an event. How many pizzas do we get per student? We've had to increase our pizza quotient. But I think that we're also starting to now see the benefit of the students again, understanding where we are, where the different activities are, what's available on the campus. Even something as simple as knowing where things are in the library. Like on orientation, you get in the library like 5 times. You learn that, right? When you're doing it virtual, it's not the same, right? And we're finding that students and parents are so happy to be back. Now we're trying to do the blended environments. How can we have you on campus and maybe 3 out of the 4 classes are in person and the 4th one is virtual, right? And so how do we blend? So maybe one class is offering once a week virtual, once a week in person, back and forth, right? And doing stuff like that, because there is some real benefits with virtual environments, particularly when we like to engage across the globe. So we'll engage with when the war in the Ukraine started, we started having classes and groups engaging with students in the Ukraine to get a real understanding of what was going on there in sociology classes and history classes, and that was a real value, and that doesn't happen without technology.
Yeah, it's just trying to figure out where it's good and where it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
What about for transfer students? How do you get them engaged?
So I think in our industry, we've done a disservice to transfer students, and partially because we listen to them too much. Be careful about what you ask for, right? We said, hey, what do you like about our orientation? What do you not like about transitioning into the college? And the first thing they told us is, we've already been in college. We don't need an orientation. We don't need to know that stuff, right? And so we said, okay, we want you to be happy. So we're going to go back. And then through the pandemic, we're like, this is great. We've increased our virtual knowledge and expertise. We're going to make them do virtual ones, right? And what we found is they get here and much like, if I work at Google and then I get a new job at Apple, do I assume because it's a tech company, I know where everything is, right?
Of course not.
The benefits must be exactly the same, right? So I can just walk in, sit down at my desk, and just start working, right? No, we don't do that in our job in the professional world. So why do we do it in higher education, right? And I think what we're hearing from students is like, it would have been nice to know where things were. I got lost on campus, or I didn't even know you had this. Well, and so now we've started to revert back at ECU especially, but even at other institutions, where we're starting to do a more intentional orientation. It doesn't have to be a 2-day orientation, but maybe it's a full 1 day and you should come here and we should have access to you. Now, if you're a virtual student, that makes sense. If you're a fully virtual student, you don't come here. We have a virtual orientation because you're going to need to know where different resources are online. But if you're an in-person, you come here. And I tell parents all the time, you want that student to have a really easy transition, then don't assume because they went to NC State that they know what it's like to go to ECU if they're transferring here, right? Even if they grew up here. Have them go to the transfer orientation at the least. A little trick is anybody can go to new student orientation. It's only a day and a half. Like, it's not a whole lot of time out of your life. It's already paid for. It's already covered in the cost for the student. So why not just register for one? We have 10 sessions throughout the summer. Every university does this, and go to the regular orientation. And although you'll say, yes, some of the programs are really geared to freshmen, you might figure out that a lot of it is not, and you might understand that you only have 10 credits. You're still a freshman. I know you don't think you are. Remember how when we got into high school, we were so excited when we weren't freshmen anymore because we didn't like that name of freshman. You're not a freshman anymore, right? And so, and we're seeing that problem now, interestingly enough, with the amount of students that are going through early college programs when they're having college credits. They're coming in with 30 or 40 credits, and I give a lot of credit to our enrollment staff and our academic affairs area at East Carolina. We've had discussions of they're coming in with 30, 40 credits sometimes, right? We're bringing them in as a sophomore or even a junior. Do we then have them skip orientation? And we said no, right? Our institution says if you have not been here before and you are going to be classified as a first-year student if you have not gone to a real college, if you've not gotten your high school diploma yet. You get that dual diploma. So they go to freshman orientation, which we call new student orientation for a reason, right? And I think that's fantastic. For goodness sakes, the best selling point for going to orientation is for 8 of my 9 years here, football players. We're a big Division I school. In big Division I sports, they have their own everything, their own academic advisors, their own orientation, their own everything. Our football players did not come to orientation. Right? They would go to their special stuff and do summer workouts and everything. The football coach on his own came to us and said, I want all my freshmen to go through orientation. They are students first. They need to learn about other students. They need to know the resources here because they're going to be better prepared than being a football player on my team. And so this year, it was amazing. I was walking through, and again, big D1 school. I'm walking by these 6'5", 280 pounds guys, and I'm like, he clearly plays football. And I'm like looking at some of my staff going, are football players coming to orientation now? She goes, oh yeah, I forgot. He made all his freshman football players come to orientation. And I was like, that is fantastic. And so that's what's happening now. And so take advantage of that. If you're a transfer student, think about what it's like to change companies. If you change companies, you go through a new orientation with that new company. And yes, there are certain things that are going to be repeated, but you're going to be shocked on the vast majority of new things that you pick up that is going to help you transition faster and be more successful at that college.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Friends, this concludes part 2 of 4 of Lisa's interview with Dr. Kneubuehl. We hope you'll join us next week for part 3. On Thursday's episode, Vince and I continue with the second part of our article. Colleges spend like there's no tomorrow. These colleges are just devouring money. A listener sent in a SpeakPipe question saying he heard that college essay is going to be obsolete because of AI. And once again, I let Hillary Dickman of Colorado College answer, is the college essay going away? So you can hear directly from a college. In the interviews with Ron Lieber, the lead money columnist for the New York Times and author of the book, The Price You Pay for College. It's part 3 of 4, and our topic is tough questions about paying for college. And we'll have a final part of Linda Depker discussing Rice University with Lisa as our college spotlight. Friends, one reason why cumulative rankings grind my gears like few other things is because they reinforce the prize mentality. I'm trying to teach you the match mentality. I've often said there's 2 types of college counselors, those who emphasize rankings and those who emphasize match and fit. All 7 of our co-hosts believe in match and fit. And that is why we believe that college is a match to be made and not a prize to be won. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode. as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Matvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.